To a large extent, this is a zero-sum game. That we are just moving things around.
Right.
And some people gain, some people lose. Part of the strategy here is to try to make sure that we, the taxpayers, don't lose. Part of the Wall Street strategy is to try to make sure that we, the taxpayers, do lose.
Right.
And this is the fundamental nature of what is going on. Now, the aggregator bank is just another name for a variant of what was Paulson's original proposal, which was called cash for trash.
Right.
Except now we've decided to go into buying garbage in bulk. So rather than buying asset by asset, which was going to take a very long time, what we're going to do is go in and haul off huge amounts of garbage out of the banks. Now, if you think we couldn't price individual assets, think about the problem of pricing bundles of garbage. Moreover, probably the bundles are so complex that a decision will be made that you haul off these assets before they fill in which these are. That was part of the problem in the Citibank deal.
Right.
That at the time that the question is we were going to insure a set of assets, $300 billion, it wasn't agreed which assets were going to be insured. And obviously there's a great incentive for the bank to put all of the crappiest assets onto our balance sheet.
Right.
The fundamental thing is that we give them money without getting anything in return.
Right.
So what would normally be something in return would be an equity stake. The problem is that since the equity of the banks is so low, an equity stake really means, appropriate equity stake means these banks are wiped out. That is to say, the equity owners are wiped out. One way of thinking about this is to realize that the equity, say in Citibank, is down to $20 billion or so, is what some estimates put it. Might be lower, might be a little higher. Well, on a $2 trillion balance sheet. Now, $2 trillion means that if the price of the underlying asset goes down by 1%, not very much, that's $20 billion. They're wiped out totally. And we know that the underlying assets, real estate, are likely to go down by 10%, 15% is what the experts think. So there is no equity in some sense in these banks. And so the whole objective here is to hide what is really going on. Banks have failed over and over again in the history of America, in the history of capitalism. It's unfortunately a all too frequent event. It has to be managed well. It can be managed badly, and we have some examples, unfortunately, under the previous administration, the way the Lehman Brothers was handled was an example of being done badly.
Right, right.
But, for instance, to mention some recent examples, Washington Mutual went into bankruptcy. A number of banks went into bankruptcy. Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, a little ripple.
Right.
And obviously some people lost some money.
Right, right.
But it didn't lead to a fundamental systemic problem.
Is there a tipping point, though, where it's one thing if you have, you know, Washington Mutual over here and this bank over here, as opposed to Citibank Bank, you know, sort of the 4 or 5 big banks, 3 of those going under? Is there a tipping point you get where it's too much at one time? Or?
The basic problem is that people have in the mind that bankruptcy is a destruction of an asset. General Motors go bankrupt, the assets get destroyed. Chrysler goes bankrupt, the assets get destroyed. That's wrong. That's a totally wrong way of looking at it. the way you want to think about Chrysler or GM going bankrupt is a financial reorganization.
Right.
The companies continue, and we should know that from the case of United Airlines, and every one of our airlines has gone through this. You don't know whether they're in bankruptcy or not. Not a ripple. The companies go on. The equity owners lose their equity. They made perhaps high returns. That's part of capitalism. The bondholders become the equity owners. The bondholders may take a hit, typically do. And in this particular case, there will need to be, as in the case of the automobile industry, maybe new injection of capital. Traditionally, it comes from the private sector. But under the current circumstances, with asset markets frozen, the level of uncertainty and all that, it almost surely will have to come from the government. So the institution continues. People continue to process everything just as they did before. Same people working there. There are a few changes. There are systems of accountability. Those who made the mistakes typically get fired, as they should. We would almost surely change the incentive structures. Incentive structures that are still in place for excessive risk-taking and short-sighted behavior would be gotten rid of. And we would align the interests of the majority owner, which would almost surely be we, the taxpayer, and the interest of the of what the bank does. So we would reduce the scope for the conflict of interest. There's always some problems with delegation, but the massive problems would be certainly greatly ameliorated.
Now, is the idea here that you X number of banks are taken over, that the government would, through whatever agencies, run them for a transitional period, or be the majority stakeholder for a transitional period of time, and 3-4 years out, when the economy is in a more stable period, then you have private capital come in and basically buy it back from the government and then re-privatize them, as it were?
Exactly. Okay. That's the model that Sweden followed. The pace of re-privatizing would depend on how quickly the economy recovers. We can't know that now. That, in fact, depends on what we do. If we don't do it very well, and which is all the indications are, then it will be a longer downturn. You know, right now, it probably, as the expression goes, we will probably wind up doing the right thing, but after we've exhausted all alternatives. The issue is not to let them fail. The issue is to engage in financial reorganization to allow them to continue to serve the financial needs of the country, both the U.S., UK, but with making our banks play by the rules that we've established for a long time, basic rules of capitalism. There's upside and there's downside, that they may be too big to fail, they're not too big to be financially reorganized.
And in practice, what this means is whether it's the UK government or the US government, we become the vast majority stakeholder, and we are running the institution for some intermediate period of time before they're reprivatized in a more stable economy.
We have already become the majority supplier of capital to these banks. That's the reality. So, in a sense, we have become the owner. But we are an owner without control. That is a recipe for disaster. The separation of ownership and control. We provided the capital. They're running it for their own interest. We see what that meant. We've already seen what that meant. That means bleeding the banks, getting out. We call it asset stripping. Seen it all over the world. For economists, you might say this is a relief. Our theories about self-interested behavior are being verified. But from a policy point of view, it's an utter disaster. And so we have to unify ownership and control.